Good morning, and thank you for joining our webinar today, Gover Not, 7 Assumptions Not to Make About Data Governance. I hope you're having a great day so far. My name is Kelly Hamilton, and I'm the Principal of Marketing here at Zion, and I'm lucky to be your moderator today. But before we get started, I want to go over 2 housekeeping items with you. First, we welcome and encourage your questions throughout the entire webinar. To ask a question, all you need to do is type your question directly in the GoToWebinar control panel and hit submit. Following today's presentation, we'll answer as many of the questions as we can to make sure all your questions are answered and addressed. Secondly, we're also recording today's webinar. We'll post it on the Zion website later this week, and I'll send you an email once it's live in case you'd like to watch it again or forward it along to your colleagues. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers. Dick Wilson is a governance expert who we also call the Governator. Dick has more than 20 years of industry experience in technology and operations with large financial institutions in both the US and in China. He focuses on delivering strategy, information architecture, and solutions for risk, client management, regulatory compliance, and strategic business information needs in highly complex environments, as well as establishing real-world data management oversight to maintain integrity of data. We also have Kas Arya. He's a principal of strategy execution here at Zion. He has more than 20 years of combined consulting and leadership experience, focusing on enterprise strategy, data governance, program management and design, and technology management. Kas is responsible for developing and managing our data practice, and he's also led the development of our Agile Data Maturity Model, which gives a framework for organizations to transform from being data aware to data driven. So thank you both, Dick and Vikas, for being our speakers today. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to you two.
Great. Thank you, Kelly. And again, just want to thank all of our listeners this afternoon for joining us. Before we get into the most interesting part of our discussion today, I just want to preface sort of, how we're going to go through each of these topics. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce, each one of these pitfalls. I'll certainly talk about, sort of why that topic is interesting and certainly important to our clients in the broader market. And then after that, I'm going to turn things over to Dick and ask him to share some of his experiences from the field and also provide some advice to the listeners today in terms of how you can avoid some of these challenges and some of these issues as you build your data governance program. So let's get right into it. So pitfall number 1. So here we want to talk about where a lot of organizations think about data governance really being, about only about information security. And Dick, listen, we can certainly appreciate this, right? Given the increase in digital information, it's certainly easy to see why companies are so focused on securing their data assets. And certainly we can agree that information security is an important aspect of data governance, but it takes much more to ensure reliability and availability of your data assets. So Dick, let's share with the listeners your thoughts about why companies often place too much emphasis on this one aspect of data governance, and certainly what they can do to ensure that they are focused on information security, but they don't miss out on the other aspects of data governance.
Sure, thanks, Vikas. Yeah, I spent several years working with one of the large government-owned banks in China and became very familiar with Chinese culture. So I thought I'd first share a cautionary tale from the mid-20th century. There was a provincial official in the northern provinces who was, like some others in his situation, a corrupt governor, and he amassed a large degree of wealth by embezzling funds, like receiving gifts and taking kickbacks. But naturally, he was afraid of being found out, so he realized he couldn't keep his gains in the bank, and so he took them and put them in an inner room in his house. When his successor finally took over, they opened that room and found out that it was full of piles and piles of cash. And the unfortunate thing was that at least half of it was like eaten up with dry rot and had been used as sort of the playground for rodents and other varmints. So he had succeeded in securing this fortune that he made, but he totally failed in being able to benefit from it or even maintain it while he was alive. A lot of times our attitudes towards data seem to be pretty similar and driven by fear. We secure our information, but haven't really quite figured out what else to do with it. Now, the response to this issue, in my experience, really starts with taking a look at what we need to do to allocate resources and how we've allocated our personnel. How many folks in your organization are focused on keeping data safe versus the people whose job it is to keep the data reliable and available? When I started my previous company's enterprise function for data architecture, strategy, and governance, I took a look at this. For each person who was designated as a data architect across the organization, there were at least 30 people in information security trying to keep the data from going anywhere. And there were 6 or 7 application architects and infrastructure architects who were trying to make sure that there was a good way of storing it, but not necessarily keeping it consistent or useful. So this is your first clue that something may need to happen. My goal in starting this program, which was crazy talk, and so I didn't tell a lot of people about it, was that I wanted our organization to reach parity of the number of people who were dedicated to information security with the number of people who were dedicated to data management. That took about 5 years to happen. And we'll talk more about the whole question of sort of staffing and who you're staffing and staffing levels later. But a question is, how do you get started on that? One of the key things to do here is to not necessarily start by running off and hiring bunches of people. You need to first understand the landscape of your own data problems. When we started, we didn't start with a formal group. We looked around to find the people who were fundamentally concerned about the data environment and the quality of the data across our organization, and we started getting together every couple of weeks. And I called it the Friends of Data, which was kind of a nice name that didn't scare anybody, but it got us started on having a forum for talking about the problems that existed beyond security. When we became more of a formal body, we created a prioritized list of the things that seem to be fundamental problems. And I think they'll be very similar to kinds of things that you see in your organization. We had problems with having data models that actually represented the business or not. We couldn't tell where data was or what it meant because there was problems with metadata across the organization. People didn't know where to get data from. There wasn't really any common plan for how to distribute information and make sure it was reliable, and on, things like that. We came up with 3 or 4 things that when we looked back after sort of 3 or 4 years, we found out that we'd made progress in them and added a few more to them, but the list is not huge. So you can get started by bringing together the people that care about data in your organization and starting to think through how to organize your view of the problems and the potential solutions. So back to you, Vikas.
Great, thank you, Dick. So the moral of the story there for our listeners is within your organization, find your friends of data and have those folks, as Dick was saying, formulate exactly what the problem statement is, identify those gaps and those issues in your data operations, and then go from there in terms of finding a solution. So Dick, thank you for sharing that. Let's move on to our second topic of discussion. This is an interesting one. So, Dick, I've spent over 2 decades working in environments where certainly there's sometimes a disconnect between your IT group and the business folks. And Dick, you've been doing this a lot longer than me, which is a really long time. And so being lifelong technology professionals, we can appreciate, right, that sometimes you are going to have disconnect between what business users expect and what IT can deliver, or what it ultimately delivers. So, but given its importance to achieving business goals, data is not immune from this disconnect, right, or from this struggle. But on a positive note, we are starting to see a shift towards increased collaboration between business and IT. And while these two groups continue to improve collaboration, we see a growing appreciation to understand how the business wants to use data prior to investing in technology. So, Dick, let's share with the readers some of your lessons from the field and how we can increase and improve collaboration between the business users and our IT staff.
Sure. Yeah, I developed software systems for a good 12 years or so before I started realizing that the data lasted longer than the systems I developed. So technologists really love to build new stuff. And we're often convinced that if only folks in the business would listen to us, we would revolutionize everything, because we can tell them all the great things that the newest technology can do. But oftentimes, this doesn't involve listening to the business about what they're really trying to accomplish. One institution I worked with developed a 5-year plan that was a $500 million technology renewal project. The problem with it was that it had very little business engagement. When our consulting team asked them where they were getting their requirements from, like, how are you building this thing? They explained that they didn't really need any business requirements because the new systems were going to do just what the old systems did. They were just going to do it much more efficiently and faster. So we were just imagining the generation of gobs and gobs of more bad data much faster and going into a bigger store than what they already had, because they weren't really addressing some of the fundamental issues of the data environment. One thing that they did was to create a huge big data platform, because that was the latest state of the art, but they didn't really have any plans about exactly what data to put into it. And after that, big push was finished, I spent another 2 years working with their central analytics team to help build out an analytics and reporting practice that would actually deliver value from their data and pull it together. So those are the kinds of problems that can show up. It's even harder, though, when technologists completely brainwash the business people with what I call system speak, that kind of techno jargon and made up words and acronyms that people in the business start using instead of real business language. This can happen over time, and the problem is that it makes it very difficult to think outside the box, because everybody's brainwashed into this small set of techno jargon. An example that I ran into with this and had to wrestle with for a very long time was in our financial services group. The company that I was dealing with had developed a system in the mid-1980s, which was at that time considered state-of-the-art, but it was built on a mainframe technology with very limited modeling capabilities. Over the next 15 or 20 years, the financial services industry really was revolutionized by changes in the regulatory environment and the merger of different banks into national entities. By the time that was over in the early 2000s, the models from 1980s were just completely insufficient. But most people in the business environment had been sort of convinced into the techno speak of the 1980s system and had a very difficult time of imagining something that would actually meet the business needs, and they wouldn't have to go around their elbow to get to their fingers in order to answer basic data questions. It was easy for us to retire the mainframe as a technology, but it took a really long time, more than a decade, to actually get rid of the data problems and the thinking behind them that limited the business. So what actions can you take for your organization to avoid similar issues? I think Vikash nailed it on the head that you need to expect to work together and have a consistent view across technology and business of how you're going to collaborate and who is responsible for bringing to the table the expertise and the direction and leadership for certain kinds of decisions. Business needs drive information needs, and information needs drive technology approaches, not the other way around. The technology, though, provides a view of possible solutions, and it identifies the risks and cost in trying to meet those business needs. On a more fundamental and troubling basis, I guess this is really messing in people's livelihoods here, but a key factor is funding. When you take an approach in the business that says, I'm just going to throw a bunch of money at technology and peanut butter my expense by giving a giant chunk of money to technology group, they get to decide how they spend it. That kind of approach is easier from a finance perspective, but it leaves technology groups wondering, how do I explain the value that I provide from technology to the business? And at the same time, it doesn't give the business the strings that it needs to drive collaboration in meeting direct requirements for moving the business forward. There's other things, but I'm going to pass the baton back to you, Vikash, for our next question.
Great. Thank you, Dick. Excellent insight. So let's move on to pitfall number 3. So this is an interesting one, and certainly a challenge that we see certainly across a lot of our clients. And here we're going to talk about resource planning. So, Dick, we can certainly agree. Look, data governance, setting up a data governance program, and certainly making that part of your operations is not something that's going to happen overnight, right? These efforts require months, years, right? Sometimes many, many years to really sort of get them to a point where your data governance program is stable. And so, usually when organizations sort of start on this endeavor, what we find is that the responsibility for data is probably someone's part-time job, right? It's their second job, or it's everyone's job, which really means it's no one's job. But everyone, that we speak to, right, in different organizations and certainly across our client base, everyone agrees, that, look, we've got some issues with our data, right, with our data operations, but really we have no accountability. We really haven't done any assignment of roles to help solve those very issues. But because data governance, as I said, requires sustained effort and commitment, the trick is to assign accountability, but yet empower our people to work on solving those data issues without adding to the burden of their full-time job or many full-time jobs in some cases. So Dick, please share with us some of your lessons from the field where organizations have done a good job of resource planning and bringing the right people on board and ensuring that they have buy-in for a long-term sustained effort.
Sure. The first thing that you have to do as an organization and a leader is basically to make a commitment to eliminate heroes. Everybody likes to be a hero. And the other side of this coin, though, is that to be a hero, you have to have a fire drill. And nobody really likes the fire drill culture. It's that adrenaline rush you get when you're celebrating that you pulled off some kind of a death march. Maybe you were fixing a reporting problem. Maybe you were putting in the latest release. Maybe you were finally getting to merge the data between these two different systems that seemed impossible. Defining everything in terms of the latest fire to put out really militates against getting a consistent, stable approach to making decisions across an environment. And that's what data management is all about. Most people really just don't want to be heroes. They just want to do a job where they know they can succeed, where they have predictable responsibilities, they have some meaningful support to get the job done, and they know when they've accomplished their goals. So To eliminate heroes, you need to make the case for designated resources. So when something comes up, you're not scrambling around wondering, I wonder who should do this? Who should really take care of it while everybody's running away? Um, so you need to begin defining the roles that you need and see how you stack up across the organization. This doesn't mean that like you're looking for dozens of people and expecting you're going to act necessarily like you're a giant organization if you're only a small operation. But it means that you think about a coherent set of responsibilities that go together and saying, who should have this job to make these decisions and handle these concerns? Key roles that you need to designate and think about and mature are the senior practitioners, who are the people who really handle data and make decisions about data on a daily basis. And by that, I mean data stewards, who are the business people that care about data, whether it's right and how it works for their business. These are the folks who know where the skeletons are, and they know where things are held together by Band-Aids and chewing gum, and they make it work. The data architects are the people who worry about cross-system dependencies and data glitches that show up because systems are misaligned or operations are not functioning well across the organization. They're anticipating where the next train wreck is going to come from. And the data analysts, as practitioners or data scientists, they're the people who care about the potential for deriving tangible new value from the data. So it's really on the senior levels of these folks who have insight into your environment that you need to start clarifying what their role is and giving them genuine responsibility and support for the decisions they have to make. This can take different forms. You need to be innovative and think about what you can achieve in your current environment. When I started the Friends of Data movement, everyone agreed that there was this huge gap in data architecture. There weren't any data architects, but they couldn't hire anybody because they didn't have any funds allocated in their business plan for the next year. So we created the case, and I allocated 40% of my next year's budget to give different lines of business the ability to hire data architect positions. After that first year, I told them, I'm glad you're on your way. If you've created a sustainable case for this function, then you'll need to continue paying for it yourselves. And that was really the kickstart we needed to get moving across the organization. But in the long run, this also means having an HR strategy for designing positions, for establishing plans for skill development and career paths for data-related responsibilities, and putting staff in them. Handling data operations, data stewards, architecture roles, and analysts as if it's really a career path. So with those kind of plans in place, you can have a really long-term sustainable environment, but you don't have to start there. Thanks, Vikas.
Great, thank you, Dick. Let's move on to our next pitfall, and this one we call "We Need Our Own Data Solutions." And really, what we're talking about here is territorialism around data. Dick, I think we can agree that look, all organizations govern their data in some way, shape, or form. They may be doing it ad hoc, they may be doing it in silos, in reactive ways, maybe in not the most efficient ways, but there are certainly efforts inside of every organization to better manage their data assets. So we often find, look, that people need to protect their data from bad scenarios, right? The classic example of, customer data, right? We've got our customer data over here, and we don't want these other groups touching it because they might, do something with it or mess it up or manipulate it in some way, share it maybe when they're not supposed to. But what ends up happening really in those scenarios is, if you kind of look at it from the enterprise level, you've got multiple groups who probably need access to that very data. So while their intentions might be good, right, this type of behavior results in the creation of local silos of data and local decision making. So Dick, please share with our listeners how to change from the mindset of this being my data to our data. How does an organization convince its staff that shared accountability and ownership of data assets is in the best interest of everyone?
Sure, this is a difficult proposition because decisions tend to get made at the wrong level. The most important thing to understand about data, if you don't get anything else about listening to this discussion, is that data crosses boundaries. It's the fundamental nature of how data works, if it's going to add any value to anything. It crosses systems, it crosses groups, it crosses functions, it crosses locations, levels of the organization. Data crosses them all. So one of the laws of data architecture is that decisions you make about data need to involve all the stakeholders in the scope of sharing that data. And on the other side, the biggest practical problem that most data environments face is that almost all decisions about data are instead made at a project level or an application level for local purposes. So all of the decisions are optimized for the specific incentives of that project, not the company. They may be made to optimize the delivery of vendor software to you, not to help your business if you're buying software. So the decisions end up being made about this shared resource on the immediate constraints of time, function, budget, resources, and personal career development of the project managers and people who are working on an individual project. If you think about sort of recent news, this occurred to me with the whole problem with the contamination of romaine lettuce that we just faced, and the CDC trying to figure out where did this problem come from. Well, everybody in the entire country gave up their salads and stopped eating romaine lettuce. The final outcome was that there were changes in data standards for the harvesting and packaging of romaine lettuce, so that you now have to put on the lettuce, where did it come from and who did it? But you can easily imagine the people at the beginning of the supply chain saying, hey, we won this great victory. We saved a lot of money for ourselves, and we don't have to go to any trouble now because we don't have to label our romaine lettuce. Who needs that anyways? So the perspective of a particular part in the supply chain, a particular function or project, is often not likely to optimize the whole environment for data. In a business example of that, we have faced things like that over and over again in different companies that I've worked with. During the 2007 run up to the mortgage crisis, the mortgage department that we worked with, the salespeople stopped putting in whether mortgage deals were refinanced versus the first mortgage. I mean, what did they care? They were still selling a mortgage. And it worked fine for them because they got their commission. What they didn't know was that the lack of that information was throwing off the economic modeling that went on downstream to drive the investment of the company's cash portfolio. So you're looking at a balance sheet of like $1 trillion and making less accurate decisions about where to put that money. And their local decision was putting potentially millions of dollars at risk. In that example, we were able to fix the problem, but there wasn't any data governance function in place in order to balance the needs in stakeholders across the data supply chain. It had to go up to a super high executive level and involved a lot of back and forth disagreement and territorialism because there was no clear path for resolution of this kind of an issue. So this is one of the big benefits of having a stronger data governance function is not just dealing with who can access the data, but what's the value of the data across our enterprise. across our different lines of business and our functions. Now, there are specific things you can really do about that. From the business point of view, it's really important to think about the extended data supply chains that exist across your organization and how not just the groups that produce data and use it in its initial life cycle get value, but downstream, what's the value that's delivered to the organization through its secondary uses? That's where you need to build a community of stakeholders, not just isolate all the decisions to the people who claim ownership and are the producers of the data. On the technology side, it's really important to begin building into your planning for how do I build systems and deliver projects to identify those decisions that involve shared data, either that you're getting data from somewhere else or you're sending data out to somewhere else, and make those optimized not just for your particular transmission of data, but for its use across the organization. One way to help do that is to establish more clearly the data architecture role to look across the boundaries between systems, departments, and uses of the data. And usually these decisions end up needing to compromise and combine tactical choices that'll make the project work right now with a strong strategic follow-up that will make sure that you don't lose the value for the data through inconsistency or lack of approach and common processing functions in the environment. So let's go on to our next question.
Great, thanks, Dick. So yeah, this next one here is interesting, right? So here's pitfall number 5, and here we're going to talk about executive influence. And look, executive, I want to say this, right? Sustained executive support is one of the key success factors of any data governance program, right? I mean, we've just talked about, look, these programs certainly take, years, months, sometimes years, right, to implement and to mature. And so, it's certainly important to have executive support, right, as part of building this program. But sometimes organizers assume that having executive support alone, in and of itself, will solve their data problems. And again, no one's going to argue that executive support is certainly important, but let's not mistake it for being a panacea. Successful data governance programs gain buy-in from leadership, from data practitioners, as well as business owners. As we like to say, it takes a village to raise a data governance program. So, Dick, let's share with our listeners some of your experience and provide them with some advice on how to best leverage executive support throughout the life of building their data governance program.
Sure. I have to confess I'm bound to get in trouble on this one. Although I definitely see major advantages to getting the right executive buy-in. In my last industry job, I sat in an employee meeting where the CEO of this 200,000 person company stood up and he passionately exclaimed how critical it was to treat data consistently and follow data governance practices in the organization because it was the right thing to do for our company. Now, that was a great moment that I'd been waiting for 10 years for, but I have to confess, I fell out of my seat, or at least I felt like I was. We had started that whole journey 10 years before in a completely apathetic and hostile environment in the very same organization. I'd been told at the beginning that what we wanted to do was just crazy talk, and that the idea of a large-scale information strategy for the company would be, quote, political suicide. So it's important to take stock of whether your executive leaders are prepared to understand the size and shape of the issues involved in the environment for data improvement. one of the big problems is that often as not, they just won't know or believe you when you're saying that there are fundamental data issues uh, throughout the organization. And that's because they just sit at their desks with cool dashboards and reports that have great figures on them every day, and everything tallies up and it's um, reconciled. And they just don't know the pain and the problems that went into wrangling the data in order to just breathlessly get it to them in the last minute. All of the manual data processes and the dead ends that people reach trying to get the right answer. But a good executive is someone who will listen to the folks around him and ask his reports for input and confirmation about a planned course of action that involves their field of expertise. That doesn't always happen, but if you're leading an approach to improving the data environment, your job is going to be finding those people in your environment who are as highly placed as possible, who understand that there is a problem and that there are ways to predictably answer it, not just create a bunch of fire drills to handle symptoms. Now, the benefits of top-down executive management, I think, are pretty clear. It makes it a lot easier for you to mobilize resources for change. And it's also an opportunity to clear barriers, miscommunication, and to be clear about the message that's going out to the organization. So you can get people aligned pretty effectively. This is frankly one of the remarkable things about working with China, is that when they actually decide they're going to do something, there are no barriers. When we talked to the folks about the 5-year strategy, they said money is no object. So that's a great thing to be told, but the big question then is, how are you going to do something useful with those resources? The problem here is that there are risks because senior executives are not infallible or omnipotent. The problem, first of all, is instability. Folks who have been dealing with executive leadership know what I'm talking about. Interestingly, the executive who told me that my plan was political suicide ended up changing their mind the next day because we went to a meeting where the senior risk executives across the entire organization were sitting in the room saying, oh my gosh, our data is so hard to deal with. I wish that we had a data strategy across the whole environment. And all of a sudden, this person jumped up and said, well, let me tell you, we've been working on that, and Dick Wilson is here to give you a message about it. So that kind of instability can go one way and it can go another. But more seriously, in the lead up to the 2008 economic crisis, my group had gotten strong support for an enterprise strategy from senior execs who reported directly to the CEO of the entire organization. So we were patting ourselves on the back and assuring ourselves that they were committed to providing funding in a significant way in the next year and taking organized action about the data environment. And then that lasted about 2 weeks, and they were all gone because the organization had to cut costs and started cleaning house at the top. It took us another 6 months to get back to a place of some possible semblance of where we were with articulating and getting support for the position that we had going into that meeting. So instability can be a big issue. Lack of experience is another one. This is a potential because executives are really committed to taking action, and usually it's action that happens in one funding cycle. This can lead to a lot of unrealistic plans that, if followed through with, are going to ruin your program. We had to talk one CTO off of the ledge when they made the bold statement that they needed to fix the problems with too many copies of data by eliminating 200 data marts across the organization, and that would somehow fix all of our data problems. So we had to have extended talks to say, well, that's not really going to fix the things that are wrong with our environment. You need to actually know why you would shut down something and whether it's actually contributing to the problem or whether it's one of those things that we just need to have. So the problem of lack of experience is really something that you can deal with by trying to educate people in this position and make sure that they have the tools needed to make better decisions. But sort of the last problem that exists in this space that can be a downfall is just the territorialism and competition that is prevalent in some corporate cultures, and that really interferes with positive outcomes. We had one unfortunate situation where a senior business leader, in response to the lady who was driving the data management program, just dug his heel in and said, quote, "That bitch had better stay out of my business." That was just not a very positive outcome, and it took a long time to sort of get beyond that kind of territorialism. It's eventually happened, but it wasn't easy. So let's go on to our next pitfall.
Great, thank you, Dick. Yeah, certainly negative attitudes will not help get the job done. So let's talk about our next pitfall here. The most grandiose plans produce the best results, right? So in this topic here, we want to talk about where organizations assume that the most grandiose plans are gonna achieve the best results. And Dick, look, we've talked now a few times about how implementing and executing on your data governance program is not something that's going to happen overnight, right? These are long-term sustained efforts. So Dick, let's talk to our listeners about give them some advice and sort of best practices on how they can develop strategies that not only achieve the end game, but are also realistic in the fact that they can execute them and they can implement them.
Yeah, this is a problem for us because there really is a huge amount of work to do to effectively change a culture and an entire operating model of an organization to handle its data more consistently and better. But let me start with the tale of two banks. Both of these banks spent over $1 billion on data management programs to address the very same international regulatory program. This was 3 or 4 years ago. So I think $1 billion probably qualifies as grandiose. The first one, which was a global bank, was in the news a year or two later because they had invested all that money and they failed their regulatory exam. The regulators publicly censured them and told them that they didn't understand the problem they were trying to fix and they had to start over from square one. Oops, that wasn't so great. The second one, an American bank, had already 5 years before that started to recognize the same issues that regulators became concerned about. And they had begun a program and a strategy at a relatively low level of funding that when they got this requirement to fix everything at once, their plan, their grandiose plan, was basically their same old plan. They just beefed it up with an existing strategy and poured a lot of resources into expanding and accelerating its delivery. Out of the many banks that tried to comply with this set of requirements, they were the first to receive passing marks on their data management program. So the moral of the story is, just because you have a major splash and huge funding and executive buy-in, it doesn't mean that you're going to avoid going down in flames. There's something else going on. And that's this: developing data management practice effectively means that you have to start with something that you know and can demonstrate will absolutely work once. You have to show that it will really work once before you can start pouring massive resources into it for everyone and across an entire environment. So start where you are and not where you think you should be. That may mean starting less formally, as we did with the Friends of Data, or it could mean something in between. But the most important thing is this, that you need to be prepared for opportunities. You need to listen to the business folks and the technology environment and the data stewards and the analysts. And when you hear simple questions, understand what they imply and what they depend on for their solution. And those are often data management and data architecture practices that you need to build and don't exist. One of the famous ones of those that affected my career was that we got a new president of corporate and commercial banking. And this person instituted a completely new business strategy where he said, he called a big meeting and said to all of his direct reports, we have up to this point not provided client solutions for our clients. We have just offered individual products, and we've given them, a loan in the Midwest and a leasing opportunity in New York, and nothing is really integrated. We need to be a client-centric business. So he asked this one question. Since we're going to be a client-centric business, how many clients do I have? Now, how many answers do you suppose he got to that question? Well, as it turned out, he got 6 different answers to that question, which was not a good sign. And he got no one who could explain why those answers were different. So that was the beginning of a whole focus on understanding the client base and establishing a client-centric strategy. So the CIO then a bit later came up to me and said, Bubba, he was from the South, Bubba, I don't know what the hell client centricity is, but we have to make it happen. You need to come up with a plan for this. So fortunately, we had been working on this whole issue of adjusting our models and data management practices to sort of fit the new world of banking instead of the 1980s. And so we had a lot of stuff already in place to make this happen. But because of that planning that we already had in place, we did some more foundational work in seeing how to spend more money faster to get better results sooner. And we ended up with a $40 million program to address the most critical foundational problems that put in place a long-term solution. And most of the components of that strategy are still in place right now. So being prepared for opportunities just by asking or listening to simple questions like, how many clients do I have? Recognizing those as opportunities is really critical. So what's our last pitfall?
Great, thank you, Dick. Well, it sounds like Mr. Bubba was a happy man after your efforts. And so that's a really good segue, Dick, to our final point of discussion today. And this is what we call, this will all get fixed soon, right? So, I was once asked by a client, how long is this whole data governance project going to take? And I responded simply by saying, forever. Data governance should and will become part of your core operations. We've talked about that, throughout this webinar. The first months and years will be spent designing, implementing, and testing for what works and what doesn't work within your organization. And then, of course, at some point, the program will stabilize. It's going to become part of your operations, but it's still going to need to be managed and tweaked constantly as your world changes. So, Dick, in this final pitfall here, let's share with some of your lessons learned about, how to sort of keep momentum, right, and sustain buy-in as organizations start their journey in building their data governance program, but then also sort of have that sustained effort over the life of that program.
Sure. Yeah, it's really important to end on this point. And I have good news and I have bad news. It really takes time to change the thinking of a group of people from the idea that data is mine to data is ours, and to educate people of how to make decisions about data that's consistent with that idea. But there's a consistent pattern that I've seen over dealing with several, major groups, and it's really that it takes about 3 to 5 years to create solid, meaningful cultural change that affects the processes, the decisions about data, the building of systems, the configuration of moving data across the environment, and the definition of things consistently at a business level. That has happened in multiple places. Even in China, the bank that we worked with, after working with them about 3 to 5 years, they became known across the industry as the bank that had the highest capability for data management across the entire marketplace. So a second thing that you may not think about is if you don't start at the top of an organization, how do you get the level of influence that you need to make total cultural change? And what I've seen is that it works this way. If you start at a senior practitioner level rather than a senior executive level, like the CEO or CFO or chief risk officer, if you start somewhere down there, a few levels down, it will take 12 to 18 months to orient and educate the resources at the next higher level up to integrate them into value-producing roles and decisions. When we started in one of these organizations, we had to start from a technology perspective because business people just didn't really see the connection point. But we eventually got to the point where we had data steward executives who agreed, they were named, designated, and told, you need to make these decisions. That was a great step, but for the first year of the Data Steward Executive Committee, most of the time in the committee we would sit around and they would say, well, what are we deciding here? How do we make that decision? What is that going to mean if we decide this, that, or the other? And it was sort of slow going there for a while, even when people had bought into the proposition that they needed to be responsible. After that first sort of 12 months or so, they got the hang of it and realized that they had a really significant job for their part of the organization and started really getting some things done. So this takes a while. When I started, my goal was to create a program that would be unstoppable. Not that it would become perfect or reach some status, but that the forces at work in the organization would come to a point where I would know there was no way that any individual person could stop this function from happening, could stop the progress that was going to be part of the program. And I reached that point after about 3 years. And that's the kind of thing that you should be looking to, rather than just the outward symbols of, we got this committee appointed. That committee can get dissolved any day. We got this person on board. That person might get fired or move to a different position next year. The big question is, where are the forces in your organization going? And where are the stakeholders lining up with respect to recognition that what you're doing provides value? So I'm going to pass this back for you, and maybe we'll have time for a couple questions.
Yeah, thank you, Dick. That was really great. Hopefully our listeners were able to glean some best practices and certainly things that they can take back to their organizations and certainly implement as they improve their data governance function. So this time, Kelly, I'm going to turn things back over to you, and we're certainly happy to answer any questions that we've got from our listeners.
Great. Thank you, Dick and Vikas. So if you have questions, anyone on the line, please feel free to go ahead and ask them. We've got a couple already, but we still have time. Do you want to submit a few more? So the first question I have, I'm going to paraphrase this one. In our organization, there's a widespread perception that data governance is really about punishing bad behavior. How do you find that delicate balance between encouraging consistent behavior and enforcing rules?
Wow, that's a great observation. And this is really, I think, not so much a question of the, thinking about data management and architecture, but it's really your assumptions about governance. We often think of governance as being like punishing people, but in reality, you need to promote a view that governance is about making useful, effective decisions. It's not about punishing people. Like every morning you get up and decide which side of the road you're going to drive on. I'm betting most people on this call choose the right-hand side. Now, you don't have to have somebody come punish you to drive on the left, if you drive on the left. You're going to have its natural consequence, and it's going to cause a huge wreck. So the idea that governance is about punishment is really sort of a backwards looking view of things. There do need to be requirements for evidence that you complied and consequences if you don't, but the main goal is that governance provides a better way of making consistent decisions. And if the people who have to make those decisions contribute to the policies and design of the framework, then their say is included in whether they're being asked to make a reasonable, effective, and good decision, or if it just seems to be completely arbitrary and pointless. Sorry, that's one of my
Thanks, Dick. No, that was a great answer. Thank you for that. We have one more question so far, and it says, can you provide examples of some different metrics or goals that could help us as we move from thinking about my data to our data that you mentioned earlier?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I would start, if you're at the beginning of this journey, I would start with informal observation rather than airtight metrics. And that is facilitated by being a participant where people are making actual decisions about data. And that means talking with the people who are involved in design and the remediation of data problems and stuff like that. So the question there is then, essentially, is there a way I can tell that more than one person is involved in making this decision? Did I include the stakeholders in this data pipeline? Or did I just make it based on some executive choice, some project manager choice, or some local departmental choice? So part of that comes down to whether you document your decisions or not. If you are in a less formal environment, then you just need to start writing it down. How did this decision happen? How could we have made a better decision? And not as a way of sort of telling stories on people, but of just saying, look, we can do better as an environment to improve what we're doing. There's a real consequence to making decisions the way we're choosing to right now.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Dick, thank you for that response. Thank you for your time and sharing all your stories. Because you as well. We have come to the end of our time. I do want to go ahead and remind people, if you have additional questions, if you think of something afterwards, please feel free to email Vikas. His email address is up on the screen. You also have my email address that you can email anytime, and we'll make sure Vikas or Dick get a response back to you. In addition, we'll post the recording of this webinar on our website later today, and I'll send you all the link in case this was informative, you want to watch it again, or if you want to share it with any of your colleagues on your team. We really appreciate your time today, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.